He became a business legend just by eating a roasted corn. Just because his son was screaming because of the spiciness, he wanted his son to eat less. But his son said he liked spicy food and it was delicious. Richard then looked around and found that people like to add a lot of chili to their food. So he suddenly had an idea that if he coated the potato chips with delicious chili sauce, wouldn't it be a big hit? So Richard did it right away. Richard immediately bought all the ingredients for making hot sauce and prepared to make a suitable hot sauce. But because Richard had no experience in the early stage, and his son would scream every time because of the spiciness, sometimes the whole family would suffer together. However, when the family persisted in adjusting the hot sauce, some institutions in the market played with technology and hard work. They only used test tubes and droppers to mix chili essence. Although this method can double the spiciness, Richard always believed that only by using the most authentic raw materials and combining traditional Mexican techniques, Richard believed that a hot sauce with a unique flavor could be made. In order to succeed, the family tried all the hot sauces on the market, all the peppers available. In order to make the ingredients fully coated, they even requisitioned the treadmill of the hamster. After countless adjustments and improvements, Richard finally delivered the fries that carried the family's hopes to his youngest son. The youngest son still screamed in spiciness after taking a bite, but this time it was the stimulating taste he liked. The greatest snack in history was born, and it is a childhood memory that has swept the world in the future. The small snack of spicy Cheetos also completely changed the fate of the cleaner Richard. As an ordinary person at the bottom, how did he turn the tide? After reading this true story, you will get the answer you want. Richard was originally a cleaner at the bottom of the snack factory. However, it was such an inconspicuous job. It was not easy for Richard to get it after begging for help. Because he is of Mexican descent, Richard has been bullied countless times since he was a child. Even more unfortunately, Richard also has an alcoholic father who always takes it out on him. Even in Richard's school. Not much, because every day's lunch is a burrito made by his mother. The white child thinks this kind of food is disgusting, and he will throw it to the ground whenever he sees it. However, when the mother learned about this, not only did she not change her son's lunch, but she made an extra one for him to bring to his classmates to try. When it was time for lunch again, everyone came to him again. This time he suddenly had an idea and shouted delicious, and asked the fat brother to come and try it. But the fat brother pushed the younger brother to the front with disgust, but he never thought that the younger brother would taste bitterly, and immediately was conquered by the delicious burrito. The fat brother also wanted to eat a bite, but was held down by Richard. If he wanted to eat, he could pay. The greedy fat brother could only pay and hand over the goods. Richard, with his clever mind, not only successfully resolved the crisis, but also unexpectedly won the heart of his future wife. From then on, the delicious Mexican burrito spread among the classmates, and for a while, the burrito became the most fashionable lunch in the school. Richard also quickly filled his piggy bank because of selling Mexican burritos. When he learned that his future wife had not eaten chocolate yet, he took his savings to the supermarket to buy chocolate. However, when checking out, Richard was thought by the boss that his money was stolen. Just at this time, a white policeman came behind him. If he was a white child, he only needed to explain briefly, and the other party would even praise him for working and studying. However, due to his skin color, he had no chance to explain at all, and he was forced into the police car by the police. If the world treats you as a criminal, then you will most likely become a criminal. In this way, Richard, who did not have the opportunity to graduate from elementary school, naturally embarked on the road of crime when he grew up. Richard was either fighting for territory with others or fighting wits with the police every day. Occasionally, he would be sent to court and locked up for a period of time. The only thing to be thankful for was that his wife was always by his side. Until one day, a pregnancy test instantly awakened his ignorant and fearless wife. That day, his wife told Richard with a big belly that he had to make changes for the sake of the child. The wife comforted him and said that Richard was not like his father, and he was not useless. However, it was not easy for Richard to give up this cool and easy life, because he seemed to have no other skills to make a living except for mixing in the society. After Richard thought for a long time, when his brother invited him to do distribution again, he turned his head and looked at his pregnant wife in the house. Then Richard ignored his former brother. He resolutely got up and walked into the house. Soon time came to 1982. At this time, Richard's family was so poor that he could hardly make ends meet, and his wife could only feed the youngest son with milk and water. The eldest son's shoes were broken, and he had no money to buy new ones, so he could only use chewing gum to make do. In order to supplement the family income, his wife would carry the child to the street to buy Mexican burritos. Despite the difficult life, the husband, There are occasional frictions between the wives. They can still use the agreed way to regulate their emotions. The wife always encourages Richard not to give up and always prepares a resume for him. But because Richard has a low education and a lot of criminal records, he said he would be a courier. Even the porters who only need hard labor don't want Richard. When he is lucky, Richard can get a job as a handyman and help others clean up the yard to earn some tips. When he is unlucky, Richard has no job, and even his 2 children have to starve with him. Richard was forced to do so, and his wife persuaded him to put aside his self-esteem and go to his father's house for a meal. At least the children don't have to go hungry. And after some thought, Richard agreed to his wife's suggestion. Richard came to his father's house, which he had not been in contact with for a long time. As soon as his father saw him, he kept belittling him as before, saying that as a man, he let his wife and children go hungry. Although Richard was very unhappy, he did not refute it. After all, what his father said was true. Before leaving, his mother wanted to give his wife a prayer candle, saying that it would bring them good luck. However, his father said that it was useless to give him anything. Richard ignored her and left his parents' home in a huff. Although he did not quite believe it, his wife still lit the candle as soon as she got home. After all, for people who have nowhere else to go, it can be regarded as a spiritual sustenance. In order not to be humiliated by his father again, Richard made a choice in life. He swallowed his pride and found his brother on the street, wanting to go back to his old job, but the boss of the block rejected him on the spot. When Richard learned that the boss worked in the factory during the day, Richard asked him to introduce him. This made everyone present laugh out loud, because for them, being able to enter the factory was a pie in the sky. Although the boss was upset about his leaving without saying goodbye, after all, people are all made of flesh and blood. Faced with Richard's pleading, the boss was still moved by his sincerity. Finally agreed to help him say something good in the factory, and Richard finally got the opportunity to work at the Frito-Lay factory. He didn't need to prepare a resume in advance, but had to fill out the application form again. Richard looked at the form was filled with many items to fill in, and he, who had not even graduated from elementary school, had no idea where to start. He had never thought that he would need a high school diploma just to be a cleaner. He had to ask the front desk anxiously to take the form home to fill it out. After his wife learned about this, she directly helped him to fabricate a high school diploma and helped him fill out the job application. However, during the interview, the supervisor found out that they graduated from the same high school. As a result, before they had even chatted for a few words, the supervisor found out about his fabricated diploma. Seeing that there was no hope for a job, Richard quickly stopped the supervisor. Richard swallowed his dignity again to fill his family's stomach. Richard said that although he had no education, he had a poor heart. So-called the poor heart refers to the determination despite being poor and hungry. Who would actively practice themselves in front of others if they were not forced to do so? The supervisor looked at Richard with moist eyes and was moved to give him a chance. Richard, who got the official job, was like a chicken bloodshot. On the first day, he promised the supervisor that he would become the best cleaner here. Although Richard's department has only 2 people, and the work every day is boring, but these did not affect Richard's enthusiasm for work at all, and his colleagues were all moved by him. A sense of crisis. After becoming familiar with the work process, Richard became very interested in the factory's assembly line. Rick Hard saw the engineer working nearby. He couldn't help but ask about the production process of Cheetos. As a result, Richard was humiliated by the other party. He picked up the mop angrily and beat the other party violently. But this was just his fantasy. In reality, he had to put on a smile in front of this hard-won job. He seemed to be accustomed to throwing his self-esteem aside, but the diligent and studious Richard did not give up. Not everyone is so arrogant. The black engineer in front of him gave basic courtesy to Richard's curiosity, but when he asked about the operating logic of the machine, the other party's face suddenly changed. Fortunately, a friend in the distance discovered it in time and ran over to give he smoothed things over. Then he told Richard about the rules here. There is a strict hierarchy here. That row is the factory executives. They have the highest salary and benefits, and they also have 5 insurances and 1 housing fund. They like to open a few bottles of champagne whenever they have time. Next are the factory floor managers. Although they have good salaries, they also do a lot of work, and they need to take the blame if something goes wrong. The third row is the factory engineers. Although they are blue-collar workers, their skills are irreplaceable, so the manager has to act according to their mood. The most powerful among them is Clarence. More than half of the senior management are brought up by him. However, due to his skin color, he has worked diligently for 15 years, but still has no hope of promotion. so he especially hates people asking him technical questions. The bottom. The lowest level is Richard, who has no days off and barely makes ends meet. There is also an unwritten rule that the lowest level employees are not eligible for cross-level communication, because it is about respect for the direct leader, but Richard does not want to be a cleaner for life. Although he was a salted fish in the first half of his life, he now has the idea of turning over a salted fish. Richard wants to become a senior executive of the company and become a person like the president of the company. The president is a person who almost defeated Coca-Cola. The Pepsi-Cola he manages is also the direct manager of the Frito-Lay factory. The first step to climb up is to learn from excellent people. So the next day, Richard took the delicious burrito wanted to have lunch with Clarence. This time, Clarence did not refuse, but asked him what he wanted to do. Richard first expressed his respect. Then Richard expressed his intention to learn and improve. Seeing his sincere attitude, Clarence finally gave him the opportunity to have lunch. This made the good brother in the distance look envious. It seems that Richard really has hope. From then on, Richard became Clarence's little follower, but Clarence still did not agree to teach him at this time. Until one day, Richard glanced at the machine after work and found a big problem in it. Richard noticed the burnt potato chips that day and asked Clarence if he wanted to check if the oil temperature was too high. However, Clarence told him that the colored potato chips would be picked out and thrown away by the workers. Richard couldn't help but sigh that people always like to kick out the ones with special colors, and Clarence is no exception. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been an engineer for 15 years. Soon, Clarence called Richard, who was mopping the floor. Then he took Richard to the highest point of the workshop. Clarence said that he only needed to listen carefully, and he would know which machine had a problem, and even which screw was loose. Richard closed his eyes and felt it, but found that he couldn't do it. Clarence told him that you will feel it when you learn from me. This sentence means that Richard finally became Clarence's apprentice as he wished. In the following days, Richard went to work 1 hour earlier and left work 1 hour later every day. He came to learn mechanical knowledge from Clarence, and soon learned how to operate and repair various equipment. He could also replace his master to complete his work when Clarence was on vacation. Although he was just a cleaner who was paid by the hour, he was named the best employee of the month soon after. However, just when everything was going in a good direction, fate played a big joke on Richard. After experiencing the golden period of rapid growth, after the period, the United States entered an economic depression in the 1980s in order to protect the welfare of the rich class. A large number of subsidies for low-income groups were cut, and a large number of factories closed down with a large number of people unemployed. With no one consuming, the orders received by the factory were getting fewer and fewer. At this time, let alone promotion, it was a blessing to be able to keep your job. Richard's multiple transfer applications were rejected intact. In order to ensure the basic expenses of his family, Richard had to find a part-time job in the supermarket. The worse the environment, the more difficult the life of the lower-class people will be. How can you say that they are not working hard enough? Soon it was 1992, and as the market competition became increasingly severe, Pepsi's shareholders decided to close some. The factory came to save costs. At this time, the lowest-level employees in the factory were the direct victims. The president couldn't bear to see the employees displaced, so he recorded a short video. He tried to motivate the employees and find a solution to the company's predicament by motivating them. The president's words were no different from farts for the old hands in the workplace. However, Richard, who was sweeping the floor, was fascinated by it. The president said that every challenge contains opportunities. Everyone in the company is the key to the success or failure of the factory, because the president hopes that everyone can think from the boss's perspective. In everyone's opinion, this is the boss's brainwashing words to employees. However, it rekindled Richard's hope. Opportunities always favor those who are brave enough to discover and innovate. One day, not long after, Richard just took his son to eat a roasted corn. Richard came up with the idea of making spicy potato chips. Traditional Mexican food has always been popular in the United States. However, it has never been taken seriously. He instantly realized that this would be a blue ocean. However, while he was busy adjusting the hot sauce, his father introduced Richard to a street sweeper job. His father claimed that this was a stable job, and if he did well, he could be promoted to a supervisor in 1 year. But Richard felt it was very ironic that he had worked hard for so many years, and in the end, he still had to be a sweeper. He said that he already had a lot of ideas. However, after hearing this, his father started to do it all for Richard's suppressive education. Richard also started to refute for the first time in his life. Since he was a child, his father only said that Richard had accomplished nothing. This time, Richard had had enough. However, his father asked Richard to give some face in front of the guests. Richard was instantly furious. It turned out that he was beaten by his father since he was a child, and the repressive education made him unable to stand up. The wife was shocked after hearing this. It was the first time she knew that her husband's childhood was so miserable. All the time, his wife always believed that he could stand up. Then she brought her family to the supermarket and continued to select materials for Richard's hot sauce. After repeated failures, they finally made a hot sauce that people couldn't stop eating. At the same time, the factory began to lay off employees on a large scale. In order to keep those familiar faces for many years, Richard proposed the spicy potato chips plan to the supervisor and wanted to have a talk with the president. After hearing this, the supervisor couldn't help but sneer, saying that the development of a new product not only takes several years, but the cost of listing is as high as millions. The supervisor said that a toilet cleaner can't dream of spring and autumn. Seeing the supervisor like this, Richard could only leave disappointed. However, Richard, who was unwilling to give up, sneaked into the supervisor's office in the middle of the night when no one was there, and found the phone number of the president's office, and then called the president in Italy directly the next day. Richard faced the secretary's scrutiny. Richard said in a high-sounding manner that he was a factory optical reflective surface maintenance engineer. The secretary suddenly couldn't think of, "I see. It took me a long time to realize that it was just a cleaner." Richard quickly said that he had an idea that could save the factory and countless people who worked hard to survive. Perhaps it was because of his empathy as a worker that the secretary finally transferred the call to the president. Richard first briefly introduced himself and then expressed his ideas. During the conversation, he also mentioned that he was inspired by the president's words, that he should think like the president. The president was surprised after hearing this. He never thought that a cleaner would practice his ideas so hard. Richard took the opportunity to ask for some samples to be sent over. The president, who was unwilling to give up any opportunity, readily agreed. After getting the address, they immediately brought the samples to the express station. Soon, the sample arrived at the president's office. The president looked at the red product without any quality assurance. The president hesitated to take a bite, but in the end he put it in his mouth with a try-it attitude. After just a small bite, the president was so spicy that he wanted to drink water immediately, but strangely, the spiciness became more and more intense. Richard then received a call from the president, who forgot to wipe his hands. At this time, his mind was full of Richard's thoughts, and he decided to meet in person in 2 weeks to talk. The senior executives went crazy when they learned that the president was coming. The senior executives, from top to bottom, called one after another to ask who had alarmed the president. It was not until the supervisor received the call that he realized that it was Richard's doing. Then the supervisor criticized Richard in front of everyone. If the president does not adopt Richard's suggestion and finds out that the factory has been losing money, he will definitely withdraw investment and close the factory, and everyone will lose their jobs because of you. Now Richard begins to doubt his decision. He cannot bear this responsibility and does not know where to go next. What will happen to his family if he fails? When the wife saw her husband's depressed look, she pulled him to the mirror to cheer him up. "You are such an excellent person. They are afraid that you, a poor boy, will become their savior." The wife said that after so many years together, she has always believed that her husband will succeed one day. The wife firmly said that even if he fails, we will always accompany you. What more could a husband ask for with such a wife? The words finally made Richard regain his confidence. But the main problem now is that Richard doesn't know how to give a business speech. So his wife took Richard to the library, taught him business knowledge, and carefully prepared a speech. In just 2 weeks, this man who didn't even graduate from elementary school, Richard studied very hard with the support of his family. The day of the president's inspection soon arrived. The wife carefully selected a tie for him that she usually wouldn't buy. Richard was so formal for the first time in his life. The wife told Richard that he looked so handsome. Richard responded to his wife that it was all your credit. However, when it came to the tie, when he was taking the car, his wife lied that she couldn't do it. Then she gave the opportunity to Richard's father. After many years, his father finally let go of his long-standing prejudice and not only acknowledged his son's excellence. The father also sincerely apologized for his behavior over the years. At this moment, Richard also untied the knot in his heart for many years. When the president's extended Lincoln arrived at the factory, the moment of fate finally came. At this moment, Richard was still nervously reciting the manuscript in the car. Richard thought that the way of meeting should be like this. Everyone treated him as a hero. He walked calmly to the president to introduce himself, and finally succeeded. From then on, Richard reached the peak of his life. However, in fact, Richard D. did indeed walk through the crowd in a panic, and then shook hands with the president in a panic. Fortunately, the president did not care about these details, but asked him to quickly state his plan. After he finally finished the PPT, the professional terms in the manuscript made him read it haltingly. It could not express Richard's true thoughts at all, and finally he simply turned off the PPT and threw away the manuscript. Richard directly admitted that the variety of products in the factory was too monotonous. You know, at this time, the number of Mexicans in the United States is already greater than the total number of Australians, and spicy French fries can let them taste the taste of their hometown. This means that this is a huge blue ocean market. However, the regional manager suddenly asked, "What is the market share of this snack?" He has no idea about the market share. Richard's mind went blank for a moment, but he suddenly thought of the length of the goods on the supermarket shelves, so Richard smiled confidently. Richard opened his arms to show that at least there was this much market share. The senior executives were immediately ridiculed by Richard. At this time, Richard stopped pretending and said directly and generously that he really didn't know what market share was, Richard, but he knew the feeling of being valued. If the company had such a food produced specifically for them, it would definitely set off a market boom. Hearing this, the president stood up. He opened his arms like Richard and asked the senior executives present, "Has any one of you noticed such a large market?" At the same time, he also thanked Richard, gave him a lot of things to think about. Then the president invested in this product, despite the opposition of shareholders. Soon a product called Hot Laquito entered the production line and successfully entered the shelves of major shopping malls. However, a few weeks later, Hot Laquito not only did not sell well, but became a slow-selling product on the shelves. The regional manager, who had been embarrassed before, had a reason to stop production at the factory and said that you should wake up from your dream. Richard, who was hit hard, began to give up on himself. He felt more and more that he was just a salted fish struggling at the bottom, and he couldn't make any big waves at all. However, Master Clarence didn't think so. You can't give up on yourself just because the product can't be sold. Clarence said that you should think about the reason Clarence didn't want Richard to be a nobody in 20 years. The master's words cheered Richard up again, but he just couldn't figure out why he couldn't sell it. Until the eldest son told Richard that no one knew what snacks were in the bag, so how could they sell it? Richard then understood the problem, but where did they get the money to advertise? Just then, the eldest son took out the food money he had saved for several years. The family's heart was together. What reason did they have for not being successful? So Richard found his former gangster friends again. Although these people were idle all day long, they were definitely good at sales. Not only that, Richard also came to the factory to encourage everyone's confidence in Hot Cheetos. The supervisor wanted to step forward to stop him, but was stopped by his good brother on the spot. Someone mocked Richard, and Clarence told him to shut up on the spot. Richard is no longer fighting alone. He carries the hopes of countless families and represents the hopes of the lower-class people. Everyone here understands. The slow sales of Hot Cheetos are not because of the bad taste. Finally, under Richard's impassioned call, everyone joined the Hot Cheetos sales army. They held crazy roadshows on the streets and alleys, and then gave away free Hot Cheetos for tasting. Richard even led his family to the supermarket to buy crazy goods, so, to create a hotspot to attract attention. When others curiously asked him what he bought, he took the opportunity to recommend it to them. For a while, Hot Cheeto appeared in various occasions throughout the region. Just like the Mexican burritos when Richard was a child, Hot Cheeto soon became a very popular snack in the region. For a period of time afterwards, it was even sold out. When the sales data was sent to the president, he curiously asked how much the regional manager had invested in promotion, but he never thought that he didn't invest a penny. Then the president called Richard again and asked him to quickly increase production to 5 million boxes. At this moment, the factory on the verge of bankruptcy went completely crazy. All production lines were fully started, and all laid-off employees were recalled overnight. Overtime. At this time, Spicy Cheetos is no longer a snack. It carries the dreams and expectations of Richard and everyone, and behind it are the hopes and reliance of countless families. Everyone's work enthusiasm is in full swing, and the factory's machines are almost smoking in order to meet the orders. In just half a year, the factory has exceeded its previous heyday. Everyone's overtime is back, and they have a stable income again. That day, Clarence came over with a smile. Without a second thought, he was finally promoted to the director of the new factory. Richard was happy for his master. Richard nervously asked about his job transfer. He didn't dare to ask for too much, just hoped to be a respectable mechanical maintenance worker. When Richard got a negative answer, he was once again extremely disappointed. What made him even more upset was that the supervisor ordered him to clean the toilet upstairs. Although he was very helpless, he had to go. As a result, Richard just pushed the equipment to the second floor, but unexpectedly met the president, who was leaning against the door of the office. Just when Richard was surprised, the president chatted with him gently. It turned out that the president was also penniless when he was a child. When he realized that dreams could not be bound, he left his hometown to work hard for a career. Now he saw Richard's dream again. Richard was confused by the words. The president did not say much, but turned around and put a golden piece of the name tag was inserted into the doorframe. The words on it were Richard, Multicultural Sales Director. Richard looked at all this in disbelief. There was too much unyielding persistence and baptism of sweat along the way. Just when he confirmed with the president again and again, someone downstairs suddenly called his name, and then there was a long applause. This applause was not only an affirmation of Richard's struggle, but also an encouragement to all the grassroots strugglers. Until Richard came to his office and sat down, Richard still felt like a dream. After calming down, he immediately called his wife at work. Richard shared this joy with his wife. The wife who reacted was happy for a while. He cried and then squatted on the ground. The Birth of Hot Rachido, directed by Ivar Longoria, starring West Garcia and Annie Gonzalez, a historical biographical film released in 2023. This film is based on the real life of Richard Montañez. His story has become a legend in the sales industry. He is also known as the godfather of Latino marketing. When he was an executive at PepsiCo and Frito-Lay, he opened up a new era of spicy snacks with customers as the starting point. Until 2019, after 42 years of innovation and leadership, he retired with honor. All these achievements are inseparable from his wife, who has silently encouraged him for 48 years. This is a hymn dedicated to ordinary strugglers. Richard went from a cleaner to a public servant. The story of the marketing director of a company, breaking the stereotype that success only belongs to the elite. He did not regard his cultural background as a shackle. Instead, he turned it into a source of innovation. He injected the spicy gene of Mexican cuisine into snacks. Not only created the taste miracle of hot Cheetos, it also made the Latin American group from being stared at by consumers to become a respected cultural exporter. This is an enlightenment about possibilities. Richard's story tells us, the value of life does not lie in the height of the starting point, but in whether you dare to sow dreams in the cracks of reality. When he proposed product ideas as a cleaner, what he challenged was not only the corporate system, but also the prejudice of the entire society. This courage is just like the spicy taste that appears repeatedly in the film. Although spicy, it stings but makes people unable to stop. He tells us that true success is not the fame and success defined by the world, but being loyal to the inner love and broadening the dimension of life through persistence. This movie is like a generation of hot Cheetos, which is the bitterness of struggle. The mellowness of culture is savored carefully, and the warmth of humanity is savored aftertaste. He makes us believe that even the most ordinary soul can be tempered into a brilliant light in the melting pot of the times. When we cheer for Richard's counterattack, is it not a tribute to every ordinary person who is unwilling to be mediocre? May everyone find their own spicy taste in the recipe of life. Well, today's movie is shared here. Welcome to like, comment, and forward. Thank you for your patience. Looking forward to meeting you next time.